Antarctica, Earth's southernmost continent. Situated almost entirely south of the Antarctic Circle and surrounded by the Southern Ocean, it contains the geographic South Pole. Antarctica is the fifth largest continent, being nearly twice the size of Australia, and has an area of 14.2 million square kilometers, 5.5 million square miles. Most of Antarctica is covered by ice, with an average thickness of 1.9 kilometers, 1.2 miles. Antarctica is on average the coldest, driest, and windiest of the continents, and has the highest average elevation. It is mainly a polar desert, with annual precipitation of 200 millimeters, 8 inches, along the coast and far less inland. About 70% of the world's freshwater reserves are frozen here, which if melted would raise global sea levels by over 60 meters, 200 feet. Antarctica holds the record for the lowest measured temperature on Earth, -89.2 degrees Celsius, -128.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The average temperature for the third quarter, the coldest part of the year, is -63 degrees Celsius, -81 degrees Fahrenheit. The Endurance. Designed by Ole Anderud Larsen, Endurance was built at the Fromnes shipyard in Sandefjord, Norway, and fully completed on December 17, 1912. She was built under the supervision of master wood shipbuilder Christian Jacobsen, who was renowned for insisting that all men in his employment were not just skilled shipwrights but also be experienced in seafaring aboard whaling or sealing ships. Every detail of her construction had been scrupulously planned to ensure maximum durability. Endurance was the three-mast barkentine in which Sir Ernest Shackleton and a crew of 27 men and one cat sailed for the Antarctic on the 1914-1917 Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. The ship was launched in December 17, 1912 from Sandefjord in Norway. She was 144 feet, 44 meters, long, with a 25 feet, 7.6 meters, beam, and measured 348 gross tons. Her original purpose was to provide luxurious accommodation for small tourist and hunting parties in the Arctic as an ice-capable steam yacht. As launched, she had 10 passenger cabins, a spacious dining saloon and galley, with accommodation for 2 cooks, a smoking room, a dark room to allow passengers to develop photographs, electric lighting, and even a small bathroom. At the time of her launch, Endurance was arguably the strongest wooden ship ever built, with the possible exception of Fram, the vessel used by Fridtjof of Nansen and later by Roald Amundsen. There was one major difference between the ships. Fram was bull-bottomed, which meant that if the ice closed in against her, the ship would be squeezed up and out and not be subject to the pressure of the ice compressing around her. Endurance, on the other hand, was designed with great inherent strength in her hull in order to resist collision with ice floes and to break through pack ice by ramming and crushing. She was therefore not intended to be frozen into heavy pack ice, and so was not designed to rise out of a crush. In such a situation, she was dependent on the ultimate strength of her hull alone. To find crew for the Endurance, Shackleton reportedly placed an advertisement in the Times of London, reading, quote, "Men wanted for hazardous journey. Small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful. Honor and recognition in case of success," end quote. Carl Hopkins Elmore quoted Shackleton's advertisement as saying that, quote, "So overwhelming was the response to his appeal that it seemed as though all the men of Great Britain were determined to accompany him," end quote. Final voyage. Endurance sailed from Plymouth on August 6, 1914 and set course for Buenos Aires, Argentina, under Worsley's command. Shackleton remained in Britain, finalizing the expedition's organization and attending to some last-minute fundraising. This was Endurance's first major voyage following its completion and amounted to a shakedown voyage. The trip across the Atlantic took more than 2 months. Built for the ice, her hull was considered by many of her crew too rounded for the open ocean. Shackleton took a steamer to Buenos Aires and caught up with his expedition a few days after Endurance's arrival. On October 26, 1914, Endurance sailed from Buenos Aires to what would be her last port of call, the whaling station at Grytviken on the island of South Georgia, where she arrived on November 5. She left Grytviken on December 5, 1914, heading for the southern regions of the Weddell Sea. 2 days after leaving South Georgia, Endurance encountered polar pack ice and progress slowed to a crawl. For weeks Endurance worked its way through the pack, averaging less than 30 miles, 48 kilometers, per day. By January 15, 1915, Endurance was within 200 miles, 320 kilometers, of her destination, Vahsel Bay. By the following morning, Heavy pack ice was sighted, and in the afternoon a gale developed. Under these conditions it was soon evident progress could not be made, and Endurance took shelter under the lee of a large grounded iceberg. During the next 2 days, Endurance moved back and forth under the sheltering protection of the berg. On January 18, the gale began to moderate and Endurance set the topsail with the engine at slow. The pack had blown away. Progress was made slowly until hours later Endurance encountered the pack once more. It was decided to move forward and work through the pack, and at 5 p.m. Endurance entered it. This ice was different from what had been encountered before, and the ship was soon amongst thick but soft brash ice, and became beset. The gale increased in intensity and kept blowing for another 6 days from a northerly direction towards land. By January 24, the wind had completely compressed the ice in the Weddell Sea against the land, leaving Endurance icebound as far as the eye could see in every direction. All that could be done was to wait for a southerly gale to start pushing in the other direction, which would decompress and open the ice. In the early morning of January 24, a wide crack appeared in the ice 50 yards, 46 meters, ahead of the ship. Initially 15 feet, 4.6 meters, across, by mid-morning the break was over a quarter of a mile, 0.4 kilometers, wide, giving the men on the Endurance hope that the ice was breaking up. But the break never reached the ship itself, and despite 3 hours under full sail and full speed on the engine, the ship did not budge. Over the next days, the crew waited for the southerly gale to release the pressure on the ice, but while the wind backed to the hoped for south or southwest direction, it remained light and erratic. Occasional breaks in the ice were spotted, but none reached the ship and all closed up within a few hours. Trials were made on January 27 with cutting and breaking the ice around the ship by manual labor, but this proved futile. On February 14, an open channel of water opened up a quarter of a mile, 0.4 kilometers, ahead of the ship, and dawn showed the Endurance was afloat in a pool of soft, young ice no more than 2 feet, 0.61 meters, thick, but the pool was surrounded by solid pack ice of 12 to 18 feet, 3.7 to 5.5 meters, in thickness, blocking the path to the open lead. A day's continual work by the crew saw them hack a clear channel 150 yards, 140 meters, long. This work continued through the following day, February 15, and, with steam raised, the Endurance was backed up within her pool as far as possible to allow the ship to ram her way through the channel. As the ship went astern for successive attempts, lines were attached from the bow to loosened blocks of ice, estimated to weigh 20 tons, in order to clear the path. The pool proved too small for the ship to gain enough momentum to successfully ram her way clear, and by the end of the day the ice began to freeze up again. By 3 p.m., the Endurance had made 200 yards, 180 meters, of distance through the ice, with 400 yards, 370 meters, still to go to clear water. Shackleton decided that the consumption of coal and manpower, and the risk of damage to the ship, was too great and called a halt. After this frustration, Endurance's boilers were extinguished, committing the ship to drift with the ice until released naturally. On February 17, the sun dipped below the horizon at midnight, showing the end of the Antarctic summer. On February 24, regular watches on the ship were cancelled, with the Endurance now functioning as a shore station. The ship had slowly drifted south and at this point was within 60 miles, 97 kilometers, of the intended landing point at Vosel Bay. But the icy terrain between the ship and the shore was too arduous to travel while carrying the materials and supplies needed for the overland expedition. By March, navigational observations showed that the ship, and the mass of pack ice that contained her, was still moving, but now swinging towards the west to northwest and increasing in the speed of its drift, moving 130 miles, 210 kilometers, between the start of March and May 2, when the sun disappeared below the horizon and the dark Antarctic winter began. On July 14, 1915, Endurance was swept by a southwest gale, with wind speeds of 112 kilometers per hour, 31 meters per second, 70 miles per hour, a barometer reading of 28.88 in Hg, 978 HPa, and temperatures falling to -33 degrees Fahrenheit, -36 degrees Celsius. The blizzard continued until July 16. This broke up the pack ice into smaller, individual floes, each of which began to move semi-independently under the force of the weather, while also clearing water in the north of the Weddell Sea. This provided a long fetch for the south-setting wind to blow over and then for the broken ice to pile up against itself while individual parts moved in different directions. This caused regions of intense localized pressure in the ice field. The ice began working, with sounds of breaking and colliding ice audible to those on the ship through the next day. Breaks in the ice were spotted but none approached the ice holding the Endurance. During July the ship drifted a further 160 miles, 260 kilometers, to the north. On the morning of August 1st, a pressure wave passed through the floe holding the ship, lifting the 400-ton Endurance bodily upwards and heeling the ship sharply to her port side before she dropped into a pool of water, afloat again for the first time in nearly 6 months. The broken sections of floe closed in around the ship on all sides, jarring the Endurance forward, backwards, and sideways in violent fashion against the other slabs of ice. After over a quarter of an hour, a force from astern pushed the ship's bow up onto the floe, lifting the hull out of the pressure and with a list of 5 degrees to her port side. A gale overnight further disturbed the floe, driving it against the starboard side of the hull and forcing a sheet of ice upwards at a 45-degree angle until it reached the level of the scuppers. Despite the ordeal of the past few days, the ship remained undamaged. 2 pressure waves struck the ship on August 29 without incident. On the evening of August 31, a slow-building pressure gripped the Endurance, causing her hull and timbers to creak and shudder continuously. The ice around the ship moved and broke throughout the night, battering the port side of the hull. All was quiet again until the afternoon of September 30, by which time there were signs of spring with 10 hours of sunlight per day and occasional temperature readings above freezing. A large floe was swept against the Endurance's port bow and then gripped that side of the ship against the built-up ice and snow on her starboard beam. The ship's structure groaned and racked under the strain. Carpenter Harry McNish noted that the solid oak beams supporting the upper deck were being visibly bent like a piece of cane. On deck the ship's masts were whipping back and forth as their stepping points on the keel were distorted. Despite these disconcerting signs, Worsley noted that the strength of the ship's structure was causing the ice itself to break up as it piled against the hull just as it appears she can stand no more. The huge floe weighing possibly 1,000,000 tons or more yields to our little ship by cracking across, and so relieves the pressure. The behavior of our ship in the ice has been magnificent. Undoubtedly she is the finest little wooden vessel ever built. Despite this, the ship's decks were permanently buckled following this ordeal. Final destruction. By October, temperatures of nearly 42 degrees Fahrenheit 6 degrees Celsius were recorded and the ice showed further signs of opening up. The floe which had been jammed against the ship's starboard side since July broke up on October 14, casting the Endurance afloat in a pool of open water for the first time in 9 months. On October 16, Shackleton ordered steam to be raised so the ship could take advantage of any openings in the ice. It took nearly 4 hours for the boilers to be filled with fresh water melted from ice, and then a leak was discovered in one of the fittings and they had to be pumped out, repaired and then refilled. The following day a lead of open water was seen ahead of the ship. Only one boiler had been lit and there was insufficient steam to use the engine, so all the sails were set to try to force the ship into the loosening pack ice, but without success. In the late afternoon of October 18, the ice closed in around the Endurance once again. In just 5 seconds the ship was canted over to port by 20 degrees, and the list continued until she rested at 30 degrees, with the port bulwark resting on the pack and the boats on that side nearly touching the ice as they hung in their davits. This put the ship in a seemingly safe position instead of being pinched between 2 opposing masses of ice. The Endurance had been pushed from starboard to port and further pressure from starboard would push her bodily upwards over the top of the port side floe, which had actually collided with its counterpart under the ship's bilge. In any case, after 4 hours in this position, the ice drew apart and the ship returned to a level keel. The ice was relatively still for the rest of the month. On October 20, steam was raised again and the engines tested. On October 22, the temperature dropped sharply from 42 degrees Fahrenheit 6 degrees Celsius to -14 degrees Fahrenheit, -26 degrees Celsius, and the wind veered from southwest to northeast. This caused the loosening pack to compress against the Antarctic coast once again. On October 23, pressure ridges could be seen forming in the ice and moving near the ship. The next day a series of pressure waves struck the Endurance, causing the ice around the ship to fracture into separate large pieces which were then tumbled and turned in all directions. The ship was shunted back and forth before being pinched against 2 floes on her starboard side, one at her bow and one at her stern, while on the port side a floe impacted amidships, setting up a huge bending force on the hull. Parts of the rigging were snapped under the strain. A large mass of ice slammed into the stern, tearing the sternpost away from the hull planking. Around the same time, the bow planking was stove in, causing simultaneous flooding in the engine room and the forward hold. Despite using both the portable manual pumps and getting up steam to drive the main bilge pumps, the water level continued to rise. The main man-powered deck pumps did not work as their intakes had frozen and could only be restored by pouring buckets of boiling water onto the pump pipes from inside the coal bunkers and then playing a blowtorch over the intake valve. McNish constructed a cofferdam in the shaft tunnel to seal off the damaged stern area while the crew were arranged in spells of 15 minutes on and 15 minutes off on the main pump. After 28 hours of continuous work, the inflow of water had only been arrested. The ship was still badly flooded. On October 24, the damaged ship was racked by further pressure waves. The port side floe was pressed more heavily against the side, warping the keel along its length and causing near-continual creaks, groans, cracks, and screams from the ship's timbers. The footplates in the engine room were pushed up and would no longer sit in place as the compartment was compressed. The planking of the ship's port side was bowing inwards by up to 6 inches, 15 centimeters. At 10 p.m., Shackleton ordered the ship's boats, stores, and essential equipment to be moved onto the surrounding ice. In the afternoon of October 25, the pressure of the ice increased further. The main deck of the Endurance buckled upwards amidships and the beams sheared. As the ice moved against her stern, the aft part of the ship was lifted up and the damaged sternpost and the rudder were torn away. This angle caused all the water in the ship to run forward, collecting in the bow where it then began to freeze. The action of the ice in the stern and the excessive weight in the bow caused the ship to sink into the ice bow first. Under its own pressure, the ice then broke over the forecastle and piled up onto the deck in the forward part of the ship, further weighing this end of the ship down. Through all of this, the pumping operations had continued, but by the end of the day Shackleton ordered this to stop and for the men to take to the ice. During the course of the next day, parties were sent back to the ship to recover more supplies and stores. They found that the entire port side of the Endurance had been driven inwards and compressed, and the ice had entirely filled the bow and stern sections. The ship's blue ensign was hoisted up her mizzen mast so that she would, in Shackleton's words, go down with colors flying. After a failed attempt to man-haul the boats and stores overland on sledges, Shackleton realized the effort was much too intense and that the party would have to camp on the ice until it carried them to the north and broke up. More parties were sent back to the Endurance, still with her masts and rigging intact and all but her bow above the ice, to salvage any remaining items. A large portion of provisions had been left on the submerged lower deck. The only way to retrieve them was to cut through the main deck, which was more than a foot thick in places and itself under 3 feet of water. Some crates and boxes floated up once a hole had been cut, while others were retrieved with a grapple. In total, nearly 3.5 tons of stores were recovered from the wrecked ship. The party was still camped under 2 miles, 3.2 kilometers, from the remains of the Endurance on November 8 when Shackleton returned to the ship to consider further salvage. By now the ship had sunk a further 18 inches, 46 centimeters, into the ice and the upper deck was now almost level with the ice. The interior of the ship was almost full of compacted ice and snow, making further work impossible. The damage to the bow and stern, and the force of the ice against the port side, had caused a large portion of the hull on that side of the ship to break free of the rest of the ship and, under the force of the ice, be moved bodily inwards in a telescoping effect. In some places, the outer hull planks were now in line with the keel. A stash of empty fuel oil cans placed against the port side wall of the deck house had been pushed through the wall and then the cans and the wall had come to rest against its counterpart on the starboard side of the deck house. The row of 5 cabins that had been on the port side of the main deck above the engine room and their contents had been compressed into the space of a single cabin. On November 13, a new pressure wave swept through the pack ice. The forward topgallant mast and topmasts collapsed as the bow was finally crushed. The mainmast was split near its base and shortly afterwards the mainmast and the mizzen mast broke and collapsed together. The ensign was re-rigged on the tip of one of the foremast yard arms which, constrained by the rigging, was now hanging vertically from the remains of the foremast and was the highest point of the wreck. In the late afternoon of November 21, movement of the remaining wreckage was noticed as another pressure wave hit. Within the space of a minute, the stern of the Endurance was lifted clear of the ice as the floes moved together and then, as the pressure passed and they moved apart, the entire wreck fell into the ocean. By daylight the following day, the ice surrounding the spot where the Endurance had sunk had moved together again, obliterating any trace of the wreck. Aftermath of the crew. The crew remained camped on the ice in the hopes that the flow would bring them closer to one of various islands. In April 1916, they set off in the Endurance's 3 ship's boats and eventually landed on Elephant Island. Because the island was remote and rarely visited, Shackleton decided that help needed to be sought. On April 24, he, Worsley, and 4 others began a voyage in a ship's boat, named James Caird, for South Georgia. The trip was successful, and all of the 22 members of the crew left on Elephant Island were safely rescued on August 30, 1916 when Shackleton returned in the Yelko. The wreck and its discovery. Many attempts were made to locate the ship's wreck from 1998 to 2021, but all efforts unfortunately ended in no results. Finally, in July 2021, the Falklands Maritime Heritage Trust announced a new expedition to search for the wreck of Endurance, codenamed Endurance 22, that would launch in early 2022 using Saab submersible technology. If found, the wreck would not be disturbed, but instead scanned in 3D. Finally, the wreck of Endurance was discovered on March 5, 2022. Endurance 22 announced in a March 9, 2022 press release, that they had successfully found the wreck in the Weddell Sea at a depth of 9,869 feet, 3,008 meters, 4.0 miles, 6.4 kilometers, south of Worsley's original calculated location. Menson Bound, director of exploration on the expedition, said that Worsley's navigational skills had helped the expedition find the wreck. His historic, detailed records were invaluable. Additionally, sea ice, which covers the Weddell Sea year-round and usually makes underwater exploration nearly impossible due to its thickness, was recorded as being at the lowest levels around Antarctica since space satellite records began in 1970. The discoverers on board the research vessel SA Agulhas II said that the wreck was in a remarkably good condition, and that they had filmed and photographed it extensively. The name Endurance on the stern remains clearly legible. In line with the team's promise, they did not salvage any part of the wreck or its contents, as the ship is now a protected historic site and monument under the Antarctic Treaty System. So what are your thoughts about the incident? Write it down in the comments below, and subscribe for more uploads like this twice a week. Thank you for watching and have a nice day.